Hi everyone, this is week 6 video 2, and we've just seen why Wittgenstein thinks that elementary propositions are independent, logically independent. They're logically independent because they've got to be logically independent in order to be able to set up truth tables. And if they're not logically independent, then it looks like you can have contradictions where that character of contradiction isn't the same kind of contradiction which is detectable using a truth table. So elementary propositions have to be logically independent in order for Wittgenstein to retain and to hold on to his claim that he has found out what logical falsehood and what logical truth consists in. So elementary propositions have got to be logically independent. Now, how does that claim lead Wittgenstein eventually into such difficulties that he ended up abandoning the Tractatus? Well, one consequence of the claim that elementary propositions are independent is the following. If you have two sentences which can't be true at the same time, i.e. two sentences which are not logically independent, then those sentences are not elementary. So it's a kind of test of whether something is elementary or not, of whether a sentence is elementary or not, or a proposition is elementary or not, whether it's logically independent. If you find two sentences that are logically dependent, such that the truth of one implies the falsehood of the other, then you know that those sentences can't be elementary, because it's part of the definition of an elementary sentence, that it's logically independent of all other elementary sentences. Now, consider the following two sentences. The chair is red. That's sentence 1. Sentence 2, the chair is green. Now, Wittgenstein's thought was those two sentences are not independent, because if you know that the chair is red, if you know that that sentence is true, then you know that it's false that it's green. So from the truth of one sentence, you can infer that the other is false. Now, because these two sentences are not logically independent, you know, according to Wittgenstein's claim, that these two sentences are not elementary. So, according to Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, the sentences X is red and X is green, those sentences cannot be elementary. In fact, no sentence involving a colour ascription can be elementary, because colours are mutually exclusive. Something can't be red and green at the same time. So Wittgenstein's solution was to say, well, these two sentences aren't elementary. That means, really, that what you've got to do if you want to get to the real elementary sentences is you've got to analyse these sentences. You've got to take the chair is red, and you've got to perform some analysis on that sentence, which eliminates the use of the word red. You've got to analyse that sentence out into lots of other sentences, a string of more basic, fundamental component sentences. And in none of these basic component fundamental sentences can the word red reappear, because wherever the word red reappears, you'll end up with a sentence which is not elementary. So any sentence involving the word red has got to be able to be analysed such that the word red is eliminated. So colour ascriptions have got to be eliminable. That's Wittgenstein's view in the Tractatus. Now let's take some other sentences. Ollie is 6 foot tall, and Ollie is 9 foot tall. Now these sentences are not independent, because if you know one's true, you know the other's false. So, likewise, these sentences aren't elementary, and Wittgenstein therefore is committed to the view that both of these sentences must be able to be analysed such that the predicate is 6 foot tall and is 9 foot tall have to be eliminated. They have to be, in principle, eliminable. And if you really stop and think about it, there are loads of properties like this. Ollie weighs X kilograms. Ollie weighs Y kilograms. These can't be elementary because they're not independent, because from the truth of one, you can infer the falsehood of the other. So here again we have more sentences that have to be, according to the Tractatus, capable of analysis. And capable of analysis such that the predicates, X kilograms and Y kilograms, disappear. So you can reduce these kinds of properties to other ones. Wittgenstein's claim that elementary propositions are logically independent demands that lots and lots of properties are, in principle, eliminable upon analysis. So Wittgenstein basically gives us a picture of language in the Tractatus on which most of our sentences, or lots and lots of ordinary sentences involving the ascription to something of a colour or a weight or a height, all of those predicates have to be, in principle, capable of being gotten rid of upon analysis. That's what the Tractatus requires, because that's what Wittgenstein's test for logical truth and logical contradiction requires. So, basically, when Wittgenstein came back in 1929 to philosophy, he thought, well, it seems to be implausible, actually, to demand that every single one of these properties is eliminable, that you can get rid of it through analysis. It's very much, it's altogether unclear how you can analyse a sentence like X is red and end up with sentences where the phrase is red doesn't appear. It's very, very unclear how you can do that. Colour ascriptions are not reducible to other ascriptions, generally speaking. That doesn't seem to be possible. It's not clear what you do. Confronted with these propositions, it's not clear how you would go about analysing them, such as to get rid of the offending phrases and to replace them with properties which don't lead to that problem. So although Wittgenstein has sort of placed quite a bit of faith in the analytical program, when he came back in 1929, he started to think that maybe he'd placed too much faith in the possibility of analysing away properties like predicates like colour ascriptions, weight ascriptions, height ascriptions, and anything else you can think of that leads to the same error. So Wittgenstein starts to think, well, I'm not sure about this anymore. And this really worries him, because if you have sentences like the chair is green and the chair is red, and they can't be any further analysed, then you've got to say they're elementary. If they can't be further analysed, if there's no further analysis that you can do, then they're not molecular, so they've got to be elementary. And yet, they're not logically independent. So you've got non-independent elementary propositions. And Wittgenstein thinks, well, that would undermine my entire test of logical truth or logical falsehood. Because think about it this way. If you have two propositions which are elementary, but not independent, then when you're setting up the truth table, you can't have that row of possibilities in which they're both true at the same time. When you're setting up the truth table, you have to take into account the fact that they contradict one another. But the whole point of the truth table was to facilitate a test of logical falsehood or contradiction. But if you have to take into account the fact that these two elementary propositions contradict one another when you're setting up the truth table is redundant in illuminating why they are contradictory. So if you have elementary propositions that contradict one another, you have a kind of contradiction which, as I've said in the last video, truth tables don't help you determine why that's the case. Okay? Truth tables don't help you determine why it is or how it comes to be that non-independent elementary propositions come to be contradictory. Because it looks like the reason why the sentence, the chair is green, and the sentence, the chair is red, it looks like the reason why they're contradictory is because of the nature of the properties involved. So it looks like the reason why those sentences are dependent is because it's something to do with the metaphysics of those properties. Right? Those properties are just incompatible, metaphysically speaking. And so you have then a kind of inference. You can infer from the chairs being green, you can infer from that sentence as being true that the sentence, the chair is red, you can infer that that second sentence is false. But the inference seems to depend upon metaphysics. And remember, Wittgenstein wanted to give an account of inference, logical truth, logical falsehood, that didn't depend on metaphysics. So remember, there was a view of inference that we had according to which the words like and, not, or, if then, that they contribute objects, that they refer to objects. And Wittgenstein's complaint was that if a sentence involving a logical operation represents something different to sentences, the sentences from which it's compounded, then it's unclear how you can infer one from the other if what they represent is different. Remember, this is week 2. So we have the same problem here. If we have non-independent elementary propositions where you can infer from the truth of one the falsehood of the other, Wittgenstein doesn't really have a good explanation any longer of how that inference is possible. That inference seems to depend upon a kind of brute metaphysical fact about the properties involved and isn't further explicable. And remember, Wittgenstein wanted to be able to explain inference, logical truth, logical falsehood using the truth table method. So this ends up being a deep problem. The problem is this. Sentences like X is green and X is red are not logically independent, and yet it's very, very difficult to see how they can fail to be elementary, because it's very, very difficult to see how it is that you can eliminate predicates like is red and is green in favor of other predicates on analysis. Now, eventually this leads Wittgenstein to suggest a couple of correctives. One corrective he suggests in his 1929 paper, Some Remarks on Logical Form, is that we have subject matter specific truth tables. So for propositions to do with colours, we will set up truth tables differently in order to accommodate the dependence, the logical dependence holding between propositions involving colour ascriptions. So he thinks we'll set up truth tables differently. If we're talking about X is red and X is green, we're not going to be able to have that row of true at the same time. That's not a possibility, so it won't occur in the truth table. So we have to have subject matter specific truth tables. We have to set up different truth tables depending on the subject matter of the propositions involved. Well, there are problems with this. Wittgenstein pretty much immediately sees that there are problems, this isn't going to work. What problems are there? One, which I've already alluded to, is truth tables which are subject matter specific, where you have to alter the truth table in order to set it up, won't shed any light on what logical falsehood is. Rather, you will have to take into account logical falsehood when you're setting up the table. So the table won't tell you which molecular propositions are contradictions. Rather, you will have to know which combinations of propositions are contradictory when you're setting up the table. So the whole point of the truth table flounders. Wittgenstein wanted a test of logical falsehood. But if you already have to know, in order to set up the table, which sentences contradict one another because they're dependent and not independent, then that test is rendered redundant. That's one problem. The second problem is this. If you have subject matter specific truth tables, if you set up truth tables differently depending on the propositions involved, because they're dependent in different ways, you've got to take that into account when you set up these truth tables. If you've got to set up these truth tables differently depending on the subject matter, then Wittgenstein was worried that your account of logical truth and logical falsehood and logical inference will be different depending on the subject matter. So your account of logical truth for propositions involving colour ascriptions will be different from your account of logical truth for propositions involving height ascriptions or something like that. And Wittgenstein just thought that was ludicrous. He thought you couldn't have a conception of logic according to which logical, valid logical inference is a matter of metaphysics, or that where the subject matter of the sentence determines what inferences are valid. Because logic is supposed to be a formal discipline. Logic is supposed to be something that runs through everything. Logic is supposed to be something whereby the validity of an inference can be seen without taking into account the subject matter of those sentences. So you can see that if the sentence P is true and the sentence Q is true, the sentence P and Q must be true. You can see that no matter what P or Q are about. The subject matter of those sentences is completely irrelevant to the validity of the inference. And Wittgenstein thought that's got to be right. It can't be right that the subject matter of the sentence determines which inferential rules are valid. So I think Wittgenstein gave these subject-specific truth tables a little bit of a go in 1929, but he very, very quickly discarded them and thought, that's not right. So the upshot is this. Wittgenstein thought there's a whole category of propositions where my test for logical truth and my test for logical falsehood doesn't seem to work. And in order to make it work, I've got to kind of give up all of my principles. I've got to give up this idea that logic is independent of subject matter, that logical inferences don't depend on the subject matter of the sentences involved. I've got to give up this idea that there are inferential relations holding between sentences in virtue of the metaphysical properties involved. Right? He's got to give up that idea, which he hadn't liked, because he thought if valid inference is a matter of metaphysics, of the metaphysical character of the properties involved, i.e. the fact that the property red and the property green are sort of metaphysically incompatible, if that's true, then you don't have any further explanation of why you can infer from the truth of one the falsehood of the other. It's just a metaphysical brute law. And Wittgenstein didn't like that because it just meant that logic can't be analysed, it can't be explained. Logical truth, logical falsehood, logical inference, all these things, his tests, his theories about what they consist in all fall down for these kinds of sentences, elementary sentences which are dependent. So the upshot is that Wittgenstein abandons the Tractatus because he doesn't think it's plausible to suggest that sentences involving colour ascriptions are further analysable. He had faith in the Tractatus that they were further analysable into genuine, independent elementary propositions, but he came to the conclusion that it's very implausible to suggest that they are further analysable, that predicates involving colour ascriptions are eliminable, and so forth. So Wittgenstein eventually started to pull away from the Tractatus and eventually rejected it. And next week we'll see what he replaced it with, which is very, very interesting stuff. So that's it for this week. Little recap there. Why did Wittgenstein think that elementary propositions have got to be independent? They've got to be independent because if they're not, you don't really have a test of logical falsehood anymore. The truth table doesn't tell you why propositions are contradictory. Okay, because rather you have to take into account their contradictoriness when setting up a truth table. I'll just repeat that because that's a really key point. If you have two propositions which are elementary but dependent, i.e. if one's true, the other's got to be false, then you can't have a truth table which shows why they're contradictory. Because when you're setting up the truth table, you will have to take into account the fact that they're contradictory by removing the possibility that they're both true at the same time. So you won't have this row of P and Q being true together. That won't be a possibility anymore if they're dependent. And so you will have to take that into account when you set up the truth table. And then the whole idea of using a truth table to determine whether something's a contradiction or not is redundant, doesn't shed any light on it. So that's why Wittgenstein needed elementary propositions to be independent. But it was a consequence of this view that propositions involving, for instance, colour ascriptions, height ascriptions, weight ascriptions, must not count as elementary. In the Tractatus, Wittgenstein thought that those propositions must be analysable and the relevant predicates must be, in principle, eliminable. And later Wittgenstein thought, in 1929, that doesn't seem to be plausible. And if that's not plausible, then we don't have an effective test of logical truth, of logical falsehood, of logical inference anymore. And so the whole sort of achievement of the Tractatus is undermined. Okay, that was all. These two videos are quite abstract, quite technical. If you need to go back to the previous weeks to look at truth tables, do so. If you need to look back at previous weeks to look at Wittgenstein's conception of inference, do so. And we're going to discuss this a lot more in person and try and see why Wittgenstein thought this. But hopefully these 2 videos are giving you some kind of clue of what the issues are. But, be prepared to get into it more in more detail and clarity in our in-person sessions. Okay, thanks everyone.